Teresa at Alcoverro will be speaking this morning about seagrass-herbivore interactions. Teresa is based in Spain, and she's been working on seagrasses for a long time. She wouldn't specify. I think she's got a tremendous background of seagrass research. She wanted to just say that I guess her work spans not just Spain, but parts of the Indian Ocean and specifically India. So welcome to Teresa.
Okay, first thank you for inviting me here today, all the committee and everybody who decided to hold this fantastic congress here, which is actually a spectacular place. I was going to make some joke about the weather, but actually coming from Spain and having 200 liters per square meter just before we came, I cannot say a word. So I'm just going directly to the talk of today, which I hope I will carry all of you with this really, really lovely theme. And I will just start, first of all, just saying that, of course, when I started, let's say, a few years ago, to work on seagrass meadows, we had this feeling and this idea that actually seagrass meadows didn't have too much of herbivores. There was a bit of this herbivore-free zone. We were working essentially on pathways. Actually, my PhD was about trying to understand all the carbon and nutrient limitation and trying to understand how primary production was important and how all the nutrients in oligotrophic waters, essentially in the Mediterranean, could be acquired by the plants and how they were managing to actually live in so much deep waters. No? But still, every time we were just going to the field trips, we were noticing that sometimes we were getting a lot of sea urchins, spines in our wetsuit, and not just in the wetsuit, also on our knees, not just me, also my supervisors, one of them is here, Carlos, and we were just saying, something, this is actually probably important. And not just the sea urchins, we started to see and witness a lot of fish just eating in front of our eyes a lot of the plants that we were just considering to be not consumed by herbivores. So in fact, at the end of the PhD already, I devoted one chapter to the herbivory, and I thought, okay, then what happened? I mean, why herbivory hasn't actually taken so much attention on seagrasses? And of course, then I started to look at the literature, and it was actually not true. There were a lot of people talking from herbivory, and actually, if one is strictly precise, even Aristotle already described that sea urchins were actually eating plants in the Mediterranean something like 2,000 years ago. So, but not just there. In the Caribbean particularly is the place where people started to go into the water and started, particularly all the groups of people working on coral reefs, started to describe of the halos around the sea urchins. So people like Ottman or Randall, etc., started already to describe all the importance probably of this herbivory. And of course then it came Heck, it came also people like Kierman also did a lot of initial observations on this importance. No? So of course then you realize, I mean, then it came to my hands the review of Valentine and Heck, and I realized that actually I was not alone. There were more people saying that the herbivory actually was important, and a bit I started to take that path from that moment. And has to be said that other people were already talking about the importance of herbivory, but that was people working with dugongs and green turtles. But they were looking at seagrasses as the feeding ground. So people like Bjorn Dahl or Helen Marsh already have said and expressed how much important herbivory was, but seagrasses there were exclusively their feeding grounds. So just I will start by introducing the marine herbivores. Of course, I'm just restricting it here for marine herbivores. There are other herbivores which can spend some time in, that are also feeding on seagrasses, which are not marine. But I will just, first of all, introduce a few of them, and I will just put it in some groups as a function of the importance, the impact, etc. And I will start with the mesoherbivores, that most of the time what they eat are the epiphytes, so they have essentially the role of cleaning. We have lots of mollusks, amphipods, isopods which are doing this role. There have been a lot of works trying to see actually their impact. Their impact is not as much clear, but if any, it will be mildly positive. And of course, they have small home ranges. They will live in some of them can be also very specific. There have been a lot of works, and actually there have been a very interesting consortium published very recently in which they have tried to look at this effect, particularly on Zostera marina. But other mesoherbivores may have a slightly different role, and those are the ones which actually consume the plant. So those are consuming the tissue, so they have already a negative effect. Any herbivore, if it consumes, has a negative effect. Of course, terrestrial people has it very clear. Sometimes here we still think on this sense of the herbivores as positive, but they will have a negative effect. These limpets in Zostera, they could even reduce photosynthesis and primary production to levels of between 30 to 50%. So they actually can be quite damaging. And they're not very abundant, they are not in huge numbers, but when they occur, they can have impacts locally. Of course, then we have the sea urchins. The sea urchins probably were the first ones being noticed, apart from the mega herbivores, as having important impacts. We know about a lot of these bands of sea urchins eating seagrasses in the Caribbean. Then we started to notice that also in the East African coast, and actually in a review, Johan, which we'll talk in a couple of days, also started to put all this information together. And sea urchins actually have a slightly more complex role. In one hand, if they are in individual numbers, if they have no high densities, have no problems. They usually eat all leaves, do not eat the young leaves, so usually it's a relatively good coexistence. But of course, sometimes they can have important groups. They can have even these bands that can travel. In these cases, these sea urchins can be actually very negative, can create actually massive mortality of shoots, as has been seen in several areas. And as a result, at the end, they are very unselective. They can eat any kind of tissue on the plant. Then, of course, just increasing the sizes and the home ranges, we have the fish. Fish has been noticed to be in tropical and marine areas as an important herbivore. Of course, compared to the coral reefs, which fish have such an important role in seagrass meadows, this has been noticed not as much, but probably in our case we notice it a lot because in the Mediterranean it's actually the main herbivore. And essentially they're a little bit selective again, and they mainly target the young parts of the shoot, so that makes it quite, they can, if numbers are high, can be very damaging. And the thing of a lot of these herbivores is actually they go in schools, and of course when you have schools and they are large, they can actually have a very strong effect. And then, of course, we start with the charismatic herbivores, and we start with what are already the mega herbivores, and we first jump with the green turtles. The green turtles have a very important effect. They have really home ranges. They can move a lot, but when they are establishing in some meadows as a feeding ground, they actually can eat a lot. If they're low densities, they have a feeding which is the cultivating feeding, so they eat just a little bit of certain areas and then they move. But when densities start to be higher and higher, they're again eating more homogeneously. They can eat everything, and even if density of shoots is becoming lower and lower, they can eat the rhizomes and the roots. So essentially, again, relatively unselective herbivore, which can start from the tip of the leaf, but can end eating everything. And of course, finally, we have the dugong. The dugong is completely unselective. It eats most of the time everything that has There are some periods in which they have a bit of more selective feeding, in which they go more into the upper part, but most of the time they just eat all the plant. They are essentially targeting most of the time slow, short-lived species. So as a result of that, they're relatively easy. They form the feeding, typical feeding trails, and again has a really home range. So if we look at all these herbivores, we can just classify it in these groups, which will be essentially related to the voracity. The voracity often is related to the size as well, so we will have an increasing voracity as increases the size. The parts of the plant which are consumed is also very important. If they consume all the apical parts, the meristems, it's really critical. If they eat all leaves with epiphytes, it's much, much less critical. If they have or not grouping behavior, as we were seeing, the last 3 or the last 4 can be in groups. Of course, the dugongs will be in herds. You have schools of fish, and that would create accumulations of herbivory, which is quite critical. Another important aspect is how specialized are in an habitat. Lots of these herbivores are actually not exclusively seagrass eaters. The most probably exclusive seagrass eater is the dugong, but lots of the other herbivores, actually, except probably some of the mesoherbivores, can actually feed in other alternative habitats. That means that if there are more habitats in the zone, there can be a buffer, and the herbivores can actually eat in more than one habitat. And of course, the home range, again, will increase a lot, and that has a lot of consequences. So based on that, we can say that actually the effect or the impact that these herbivores can have is from mildly positive in the case of the epiphyte eaters, when they can control the amount of epiphytes which are on the leaves, to mild negative to potentially catastrophic in the case of the dugongs. No? So, but actually, what is the plant doing? Do we actually have a plant that is doing nothing? We know that when there is an important pressure of herbivory, plants actually respond. And essentially, in general, in terrestrial plants, we have 2 main strategies. Either you avoid the herbivores, or either you tolerate the herbivores. And plants have always been playing between these 2 strategies. So if you have an avoidance, you will use chemical defenses, you will use escape strategies, any kind of strategy that makes you essentially to avoid the herbivores. If in contrast, another strategy is to say, okay, you can eat me, and what I will do is that your damage is the least important as possible to myself. So I will choose one or the other strategy. How to choose one or the other has a lot of consequences, and in part, of course, it depends a lot which is the productivity of the plant, which are the rates of production. So for instance, if you have a system which has high production, would tend to be more towards a tolerant strategy, because it can allow to be tolerant. Tolerance means that you are losing a lot of things. If you are not productive, if you don't have high productive rates, you will not be able to choose this type of strategy. Defenses will usually be in plants which have low production rates, will be in plants that have a relatively not too much of plasticity and architecture that doesn't allow this tolerance to happen. And even this, which I call intrinsic factors, can be modulated even within plants. Even within the same species, you can choose to be more defensive or more tolerant as a function also of the external factors. Because depending on how much resources, for instance, you have, you can choose to be more tolerant or to be more defensive. Because, of course, if resources are available, you can allow yourself to be more tolerant. If resources are very scarce, then you will always be much more defensive. So, which actually are the strategies that seagrasses have taken within these two strategies. And if we look at the seagrasses, of course, if you look at the sea, and the first thing we look at is at the algae, and algae are among the most defended plants that we have in the earth. They are among 500 secondary metabolites that have been described. there is a lot of even coevolution between herbivores and algae that have been evolved under these circumstances. This in part is because, of course, as all of you know, in coral reefs, herbivory can be really high, particularly of fish, but other species as well. So as a result, all these realms have evolved with a lot of defenses, and particularly chemical defenses. In contrast, what we have with the seagrasses. With the seagrasses, we don't know yet as much as, of course, we know in the algae. But the first thing, and I'm just using a bit as well the recent genome of Zostera, because it's actually the only one we have right now. But it seems that actually a lot of the defensive genes have been lost. Because of the adaptations. They were not needed. Lots, as you know, a lot of the defensive products are byproducts, so they serve for other things, but it just ends happening that they also are good for defenses. So when the plants had to adapt to the sea, they actually lose a lot of those potential genes that could play a... So for instance, all the terpenoids, which are very important chemical defenses in algae, are absent, at least in Zostera. We don't know the rest of the groups, but probably may have a similar thing. But do actually chemical defenses exist in the plants? So we actually have any idea if they exist? And of course, when we look at them, here just different herbivores presented on the left. And here what we're looking at is using a cube of ulva, which has no defenses at all, and we were adding some extracts of seagrasses, okay, and then we were feeding different herbivores. Essentially, what we were just taking is the only component. We were not using any other defense. We were not using structural or other type of defense, just the extract, put into a cube in which we have the food, and we were just testing it with different herbivores. And what you observe, okay, the effect size, which is lower than 0, means that there is an effect. And what we observe is that a lot of the herbivores responded to this effect. So yes, plants have, marine plants at least with this species, has defense, and very likely all seagrasses have defenses. Yes, chemical defenses exist, but are they important? Do actually play any role? Because as we know, chemical defenses can be there, may not play any role at all. And what we did is, okay, in this case, for instance, what we have is, we took Posidonia oceanica, flowers, and we took the leaves, okay, and you can see the defenses. Of course, that is a very generic term because phenolic can be lots of things, but the flowers, as you would expect, have more defenses than the tissue, than the leaves. But when you look at the second is the square consumed, it's exactly the same experiment that we did before. So we have these cubes, they eat less the flowers than the leaves, as expected. They have more defenses, they are less eaten. But when you go to the field and you look at which is the impact of the flowers and the leaves, you see that the flowers, the impact on it's very high of the herbivores, while that on the leaves is very low. So actually, they are reserved, they have chemical defenses, but actually the role is probably not to defend. They're probably byproducts, and the main still consumption it's in parts which are still very or more defended. And then, of course, another important role is the role of epibionts. Do we actually, in marine algae again, has been seen that epibionts can play an important role in the defenses of the algae itself. There had been also even some coevolution between them and the algae. And do actually epibionts play any role, again, as a defensive system for the seagrasses, no? And again, what we did was a very similar experiments in which we look at the phenolic compounds. And what we see, first of all, is that the epibionts have very little defense. If anything, they are more consumed than what they should. So eventually, the epiphytes don't seem to play any role in protecting the seagrasses at all. So then we look at another mechanism, which is another mechanism of avoidance, which is the escape mechanism. Okay, I don't defend myself, but what I do is to escape, which is a very important strategy as well in terrestrial plants. do we have actually mechanism of escape on seagrasses? There is very little studies. I mean, there is almost nothing. There are some evidences. And actually, there are some evidences that some seagrasses, for instance, have the maximum peaks of herbivory that seems to be uncoupled with the herbivore, maximum peaks of primary production that seems to be uncoupled with the resources, and as a result, and also uncoupled with the, from the herbivore activity. So they may choose periods of maximum production, which temporarily it's not the period of the maximum herbivore activity. Another strategy, for instance, again found in Posidonia oceanica, is this unpredictable reproduction. So they have a reproduction which is not every year, it occurs occasionally, and that is again a very important strategy of avoidance of herbivory. So trying not to have any species which knows and it's adapted to determine when the herbivory will occur. And then recently we also observed that they can have this synchronized reproduction, so patches which flower very intensively compared to patches which are not flowering. And this again has been, in terrestrial systems, associated to satiation effects of the herbivores, which could be a way to divert into certain patches to avoid the other patches to succeed. All these are strategies which can be these avoidance strategies. But if we jump into the tolerance, and there is where actually we see where probably our seagrasses fits most of the time. If we look at what is the response to herbivores, most of the times, and most of the seagrasses will have an increased photosynthetic rate. All of those are very typical responses of tolerance. Would have an increase in branching rate, may have increased shoot recruitment. They would have in general, high root shoot ratio or rhizome shoot ratio, which means that we'd have a lot of a lot of resources which will be prepared in any moment to be able to respond to a herbivore attack. And the most important one is the compensatory growth, because that is the one that has been also defined as one of the most important mechanisms of tolerance. And if we look at an experiment, and there are several of them, in which you just have a mild, medium, this is really, really high herbivory, we observe that the first response of the plant is always to increase the growth unless the herbivory is really, really damaging. We were just leaving 1 meter plant to almost few centimeters. So it seems that it's very clear that, or at least for me, I already said many, many years ago, that probably the tolerance is the space in which seagrasses will move. And the next question is, yes, but are all equally tolerant? So do all the same seagrass species have exactly the same tolerance? And this is something that I'm just presenting this with, which is an experiment that is still on the water actually, but what we are observing is that just using an increased number of sea urchins, and with different seagrass species, this is a more short-lived and this is a much more long-lived species, what we observe is that actually the resistance of the different plant to herbivory is very different. With the same number of sea urchins, plants will respond a lot with a more rapidly or much later. So yeah, they don't resist the same way to herbivory. But okay, so we have these plant-herbivore interactions, but actually, so far I have just introduced the plant, I have just introduced the herbivore, but it's actually a real-world interaction. Is that the type of interactions we have outside? And when we start to look at, of course, first of all, we have more than one herbivore, but those herbivores sometimes can be eaten by some predators, particularly when we have invertebrate herbivores. And I'm just describing a relatively simple interaction that we have, for instance, in the Mediterranean. So that can be much, much, much more complex. Huh? And then, of course, you have even a more an indirect effect of the fish that is essentially modifying a trait of the plant. The herbivore is eating the leaves. And as a result of that, is making the sea urchins more available for the predators. So essentially, you have a modification of a trait, which is the plant, which makes the environment more open for the predator to eat the sea urchin. So in other words, just to simplify, if you have areas which have more seagrass meadows by fish, essentially sea urchins are eaten much more than if you have areas with the long leaves. Okay? So, and that is a very simple, relatively simple system in which we have essentially only two herbivores. So if we put much more layers and more other herbivores, things get more complex. And of course, the next thing is that, of course, herbivores, again, are not alone. They live in a seascape. So we don't have just herbivores living there out of anything else. And if we put the seascape, it enters the behavior. We have herbivores which have relatively large home ranges. So in the moment in which we have herbivores with relatively home ranges, behavior will play a role. And for instance, when we have fish, and that's an example that we found relatively recently, what we observe is that actually fish is very choosy. They don't eat homogeneously in the landscape. So you would have essentially those work on schools, so they will prefer to eat in the central part, probably because it's the way all the school can go down and feed in a continuous, all of them can be feeding. But they will also prefer to feed in areas where there are rocky areas as a substrate, so because this fish in particular has can eat either algae than plants, so probably it's the place where they have the most diversity of food choices, and they seem to avoid very far away or small patches which are a little bit far. We look even at a slightly larger dugong herbivore. What we observe as well, even at a larger scale, here what we are comparing is meadows between them. What we observe is that actually they are also very choosy. They choose essentially continuous meadows. And that again has a sense. It's obvious because they prefer continuous meadows because they need so much of energy that they cannot spend time in fragmented meadows, probably where they just will get much less resources. But that has very important and critical implications for conservation. But yeah, we have the herbivores, and they are very choosy, as we have seen. But what happened with the predators? Of course, the predators will control some of our herbivores, as we have seen. And if we observe the predators and we see how predation gets distributed across the space, what we have observed as well is that predators themselves also become very choosy about where they predate. And it's maintained in time. So as a result of that, for instance, they prefer areas which are very fragmented, which is not unusual. It's what you would expect in terrestrial systems. When there are a lot of edges, predators go there because they have more access to the prey. And as a result of that, if you have fragmented meadows, which have small patches, predators will often concentrate in these areas. And as a result of that, in those areas, you will have less sea urchins. So it becomes a really important hotspot for predation. In contrast, the areas where they will not feed too much, these predators, which will be these cold spots of predation, usually they will tend to have more sea urchins, but more interestingly, even more biodiversity of other groups like crustaceans, etc. So you have some cold spots of predators which are richer and often are small patches which are isolated because probably predators do not want to invest to go to those patches, and those are really rich when you look at diversity of a lot of groups. So that was for us that was absolutely unexpected, no? And of course then we have the direct effect of the predators, but then we have the indirect effect of predation. And as all probably of you have been reading, because it's very fascinating things, we have the fear and the effect of the predators, in this case the tiger sharks on the dugongs, and indirectly the effect on the herbivory on seagrasses. So some areas are more used by dugongs than others, just because the presence of the sharks will make dugongs not to use certain areas. And interestingly, that doesn't not just not happen with sharks. With fish, predators, like with the small fish predators of sea urchins, it reproduces exactly the same effect. And what we are observing, for instance, is that with the presence of predators, sea urchins can be just eating 50% less, just with the presence of the predators. So essentially the present 50% of herbivory, which is reduced. And if you look at in a modeling which includes the direct predation plus the indirect predation effect, it can reduce the herbivory in an area by 30%. So these indirect effects. So indirect effects are critical in these systems, and we almost never consider them. And it can be measured, actually, more and more. So it's actually very critical, because sometimes we talk about introducing predators, but we don't think, we talk about introducing herbivores, but we don't think that just the presence of the predator can reduce so much the herbivory pressure. And, of course, we are these ecosystems, but wait a moment, have we always have this type of ecosystems? Is that the normality? Are these the seagrass meadows that we have with the interactions normal? And of course, how we can know? It's very difficult. Of course, you can try to get information, go to very old books in which you can get information about how many turtles were present, etc., which is what Jackson actually did. But another way is just to say, okay, let's go to remote areas. There are still few remote areas, not too remote, but there are still some areas in which actually these places can represent a proxy of the past. And what I'm just going to explain you is a small example of that we have been following in India, in the Lakshadweep Island archipelago, which is in the north of the Maldives, okay, in which an arrival of turtles occurred something like 15 years ago, and those islands have their atoll islands, they have their lagoons, they used to have all these seagrass meadows continuous in the lagoons, covering all the lagoons, and suddenly in one of the islands a huge number of turtles arrived, green turtles obviously, and started to feed on the seagrass meadow. So the beginning was, wow, we have turtles here. Of course, we were actually working on coral reefs and dropped everything and finally convinced all the people there to work on the seagrass meadows for the first time. So we were just there and we started to look at how much was the primary production consumed, and we started to see numbers which were just not right. So they were consuming more than 200% of the primary production, so that couldn't be sustainable at all. And as time went on, what we observed is that those meadows were essentially dominated by Thalassia and pre-shape, and then they started to occur a shift. So suddenly, or relatively suddenly, in 2 or 3 years, those meadows first dominated by a long-lived, high-structured species become meadows dominated by Cymodocea rotundata. That was essentially the mechanism by which this happened was double. There was first turtles preferred Thalassia feeding, but then there was also a competition. I mean, the herbivores were mediating the competition of the two species. In other words, if you cut the same quantity in Thalassia and Cymodocea will respond better than Thalassia to herbivory. So the two mechanisms were working in the same direction. As a result, the shift was relatively quick. So in a few years, we had this Thalassia, and that already caused a lot of what we call the second-order consequences, but it's not anything else than reducing recruitment of fish in the seagrass meadows. And interestingly, those fish were coral reef fish. So most of the recruitment, we observed failures of recruitment in the islands in which the turtles were present, while in the other islands we had huge numbers of recruitment. And then we started to notice a drop, which was almost to of 80% of the biomass catch of species which were eaten by fishermen in the lagoon. And particularly important is that this fish is the fish that they use particularly during the monsoons, in which they have no other access to areas outside the meadows. So it's actually a quite critical point. As a result of that, it started the conflict. So fishermen got upset, they wanted to kill the turtles, so the problem was becoming more big. We are now even looking at carbon burial, and actually it seems that all these areas have been also losing all the carbon storage that they had. But when they were eating all the shoots in one island, what they were doing is going to another island. So what we were observing first in one island, then we started to realize that they were doing it in the other island. So then it was we started to become very nervous because we had to go to all the islands and we didn't know which island they were going the next. So we started to look at all the islands and the seagrasses and trying to have a bit of sense of what was happening. And we started to map seagrasses and at least measure a bit the seagrasses in all the islands. And essentially, they keep moving from one island to the other after overgrazing those islands to practically arrive to a functional extinction. So right now, there is only one island that has seagrasses in the Laxodip, and with relatively low biomass. So it's the Laxodip, a good proxy of the past. Well, I guess that for one, it depends completely on which past are we talking about. And I urge you to go as well. So if we have a pre-Columbian past, of course, we will have also the sharks, and that's obvious. Here we don't have the sharks. Sharks have been overfished almost everywhere except in really remote islands, and that's one thing. And as you remember, sharks were not just directly predating the turtles, they also have these indirect effects of the fear. But of course, they may be also, turtles' densities probably were not that different from the ones which have been also recorded in the past. Maybe that's also the grazing that they are used. It's just that we have not witnessed it anymore. So they have this rotational, and probably they will return when the seagrass meadows will recover. That could be as well. However, I would just tell you, to all of you, to go to see the talk, actually after this of Mario, whoever wants to know, because what we have done is to put different people together working on different areas in which green turtles have been increased, and we have tried to reconstruct this past having different pictures of different conditions. So I think that will be very nice to look. But if we go into more speculatory territory, we can try to see, okay, yes, that's what we have now, but what has happened in evolutionary times? That's Desmotilian, that was actually a seagrass eater, which was coexisting with seagrasses, at least for 10 millions. And it's not just the last one. There have been just one described very recently, which is even, well, not as cute as this one, but also very nice, which actually were seagrass eaters. And that's what the seagrasses have been dealing with, not these small sea urchins that we have right now. And not just that, I mean, if you look, for instance, with the dugongs, this is just a working in which all the different dugong species have been extinct. The Mediterranean have had several dugongs living there. We never think of Posidonia oceanica as a plant adapted to a dugong grazing. I mean, but probably any ancestor of Posidonia was actually living with dugongs for for millions of years, no? And not just that. If we look at some, and this is a recent work of Bennett and Juarez, which is actually from the group of Domin, probably all of you know Domin, they even have seen that there were areas, and not just one area, this one was in India, but there were other areas in which 3 species of dugongs were sympatric, were eating different seagrass plants. Probably some of them were adapted to olive species, to Others were adapted to short-lived species like the ones that we have. Actually, they were specialized on eating rhizomes. Some of them were specialized and had really very strong jaws to actually break the rhizomes of species like probably Posidonia. They have even suggested that the extinction of some species of Thalassodendron, I think, and Cymodosia in the Caribbean has been because of the dugongs. So we cannot forget about the presence and the coevolution. And so this seagrass grazing tolerance has actually been a response of adaptation to herbivores, or just an epiphenomenon. And of course, there's almost no fossil of seagrasses, and that's a big problem we have. In fact, everything has to be done mostly through the fossils of the herbivores, no? The actual terrestrial ancestors of the seagrasses are not particularly grazing adapted. So they are not particularly, have not the same characteristics of the plants we have, that we have the seagrasses. So as a result of that, of course, how much what we are observing now is a result to this evolutionary coexistence between seagrasses and mega herbivores, so that the plants that we are seeing now were adapted to that, or how much some of these strategies can be just there for other reasons. A lot of these strategies are actually responses to competition for resources. So having a high production rate, high rhizomes, length, branching, etc., are also strategies which are just responses to competition. So they can be just, again, a response to another factor that can actually help them to resist these mega herbivores. What I think is interesting, and I will just throw this idea here, is that actually, in general, plants that have been subjected to very unselective grazing, as is the case of seagrasses, without not too much of pressure in particular parts, are in general have no coevolution. So, for instance, a lot of the coevolution that we observe in plant-insect interactions, etc., is as in response to very selective herbivores. And maybe, and I'm just throwing this, the low diversity of plants we see, the low diversity of herbivores we see, is actually the result of this unselectiveness and this strategy of tolerance, which again, the strategy of tolerance is a strategy that, when has happened in terrestrial plants, has actually avoided this speciation. So, I don't know. However, just to finalize, we will try to go forward and see what is going to happen with the interactions in the future. And of course, we are a bit between the optimism and the realism, and actually the pessimism, if I have to be honest, because of course seagrasses have not too many chances, but some of the herbivores are in a much even worse conditions. And of course, if we look at the interactions, the main and the first probably critical aspect is the overfishing and the hunting in the case of the dugongs. And of course, that is the most critical effect to the trophic interactions that we have in a system. If we want to maintain it as it is, of course, herbivory will have a negative impact, of course, but that is how seagrass ecosystems should be, not how they are. I mean, they are just used to have the herbivores there, no? And as a result, of course, if you have a top-down, I mean, you would have the direct destruction of the herbivores, like the fish herbivores, and that's one effect. But as well, again, there is the top-down control effect. So if you are fishing the predators, then you will have more sea urchins which can explode, and they have overgrazing events which are not natural, which are human cause. So how to deal with this is probably one of the biggest problems we will have in the fish with the herbivores. But not just herbivory has effect not just overfishing will have effects. Also other effects, like for instance the nutrients, can affect a lot. the interactions. And just to give you an example, that's something we have been doing recently. What we observe is that when you have oligotrophic conditions, this is in an algal ecosystem, not on seagrasses, but the mechanism is exactly the same, and it should work exactly in the same way for seagrass ecosystems. What you have is that you have a threshold that just gets reduced very quickly in oligotrophic conditions, and this threshold just comes much later when you have nutrients in the system. What we are talking is about natural nutrients, so actually the word eutrophication here maybe it's not completely wrong. And why? Just for essentially two mechanisms. In one hand, nutrients will affect the primary production if they are in oligotrophic waters, if they are nutrient limited. And another thing it will do is it will reduce the herbivory, because there is compensatory feeding. If I have more nutrients, I will eat less. And actually that's a mechanism that has been already established, and it happens. So as a result of that, nutrients can change these interactions, and probably, if not getting really high, areas which have a little bit more nutrients will be a little bit more protected from some collapses if herbivory can be very high with respect to areas which have less nutrients, no? And of course, temperature. What's going to happen with the temperature? And probably lots of us are now trying to understand how temperature can modify plant-animal interactions. And here I'm not going to present this, because Jordi Pagès will present actually a talk specifically about that. But I would just like to note that actually temperature can affect lots of things that we don't even sometimes think about it. So in one hand, of course, it can affect the herbivores, and if it affects the herbivores, it will affect the interaction. You have more herbivores or less herbivores, they will feed more or less. It can affect the plant. If there are less plants to eat, the pressure on the plant will be higher, so if it affects the plant, it will affect the interaction as well. It will affect the feeding rates, so if I have higher temperatures, potentially or not, herbivores, the metabolic rate will be higher, and as a result of that will increase the feeding rate. Can affect the defenses of the plant, or any of the palatability, not necessarily defenses, maybe the nutrients of the plant, and as a result of that may change the preferences and the rates of the herbivory. And altogether, so try to just say, okay, what is going to happen with the interactions is not easy at all. And we just did some experiments in which we were just trying to see at least if it was affected or not, and what we observed is all this is affected by temperature. Then, of course, depending on the herbivore, depending on the conditions, etc., you try to make some predictions about what is going to happen or not. And not just that, of course, temperature is also going to change the range and extensions of most of our herbivores. It's creating already tropicalization of a lot of temperate areas. Some invasive species are becoming very important herbivores of temperate areas, which they never exist. They're just causing a lot of changes in the dynamics. There is competition. Species that never have encountered before are now competing from the same resource. And of course, finally, there is the adaptation. We don't know yet how all of this is going to get adapted. And of course, looking at the ranges of temperatures is a good way to actually see how this adaptation may occur. This is happening very quickly. So how this adaptation is going to occur, probably, if we have to have a genetic adaptation, short-lived species may have more chances to adapt. If they are not already some areas which are adapted, long-lived species probably are going to witness, and that particularly if they don't have areas where they can move, may have problems, because of course there will be no changes are occurring even within the lifespan of their lives, no? Just to finalize, because I think I am very late, how to do a bit of conservation and just few thoughts. Of course, MPAs can be a solution for the conservation of the seagrass habitats and their interactions. Usually we never think on MPAs as a way to protect seagrasses. We always think on the reduction of nutrients, making it more extensive, but probably unless we create areas which are protected, even rewilding, why not? Some of the areas may be a potential idea, but of course, MPAs can sometimes also have problems, particularly if high densities of the herbivores come as a result of the MPA, and the MPA is small, it can create concentration. So you have to be very aware of the size of the seagrass meadows in the MPAs before creating an MPA and expecting to have a positive effect. And we have seen at least a couple of MPAs in the Mediterranean, which are really facing a lot of consequences of herbivorism because of the size. And probably we have to move as well into conserving the functionality. That's something that I think it's important. We have to not just conserve the ecosystems, we have to understand which is the functionality of that ecosystem. If we want to conserve an ecosystem, we need to know which are the rates of herbivory, include the herbivores, include the predators in our monitoring, try to understand how much are they eating. There are very simple techniques to measure herbivory rates, predation rates, and unless we include this, we have very difficulty to actually see how things are evolving until they are sometimes too dramatic. And of course, just to finalize, we have the problem of conserving, of course, the seagrass flagships, and with the dugongs, I actually have not too much hope. There are very few populations which actually are still in relatively decent conditions. Most of the dugongs are very close to the extinction, even without even knowing. I mean, we know that they are there, but every time that there are studies in which we are trying to see the dugongs which are there, we see that they are much less organisms. They don't go anymore with herds. They are individuals. They are there. They have long life. If they can resist, they will resist. They are not having, and they are already facing alley effect. They are not having the possibility to have mating with any other female or male because they are completely isolated. So it's actually a very sad thing. And there, I don't know, actually, if I had to be honest, what we can do in those conditions. Of course, an optimistic thing is with the turtles, that what has been is an increase on Greek turtles over the world. It's a very successful experience. And for instance, I'm just going to explain you this very quickly. There were some conservation initiatives here in Sri Lanka, and as a result of that, what I was telling you about the turtles that arrived to the Lakshadweep were actually those. And of course, here it poses into question which is the conservation ranges, what means to conserve one thing, one animal in one place, and what is going to happen to another country. That has nothing to do. We are talking about animals which have huge home ranges, have to include any initiative of conservation considering the home ranges of the animals. We cannot just do it at a local level and assume the consequences. And it's going to happen like that. And probably we are not far from what the normal dynamic is. Okay, if we have the herbivores, that will happen. Okay, in a few years it will recover, probably. Okay, but we have to know it, because the people from the Lakshadweep are suffering the consequences of this conservation, are not fishing. So maybe we will need to do some efforts to counterpart that. And that becomes really, really complex. So just to finalize, because in 3 minutes, just the big picture. That's probably what should look a seagrass meadow. We have the herbivores, which are strong modifiers. They will have effects, but we have to conserve them. We cannot ignore them. And I would just say, let's go into a more functional view of the meadows and trying to put the functions as well, not just so far what we are looking at, should density or biomass. Let's integrate the herbivores as well. And I hope that somebody would ever look at this part which is there and try to understand how actually the seagrasses that we have today have been marked by these beautiful herbivores that we had in the past.
really amazing talk, fantastic slides as well. I think everyone's been very impressed.
Well,
with
actually,
that.
I have to give credit. The slides were with my Rohan, which is my husband. He had a perfect excuse not to do anything at home for the last days because he was preparing his drawings.
It'd be a shame not to have one question though, so go on.
No.
So if you, in the like Shepherd Islands, if you were to control the turtle population, allow harvesting, limited harvesting, could you get the system back into balance? And is that something that we should be thinking about as part of balancing and protection of the seagrass as well as the
I mean, this is a very difficult question. We don't know what is a natural population actually, and it's very difficult to say. I have the feeling that that was happening before, so that probably when we had all the large herbivores, lots of the seagrass meadows were dominated by much short-lived species than the ones we have right now, and probably some of them were just disappearing and reappearing after a few decades, no? And herbivores were moving, and that was just probably a natural. So I wouldn't actually say to touch the turtles, maybe just to be aware of the consequences for the population. And most of the seagrasses actually manage to reappear in few years. Turtles will leave because they will not have food. So.
But the fish won't be there until the seagrass come back,
That's
and
true.
then the human
That's true.
is going to suffer. So, and of course, you don't have the big sharks and the big grazers.
That's
which
true.
also balance.
That's
that.
true. That is true. So the question is: do we have to act as a tiger shark? And that's maybe the question, no?
Yeah.
Do we have to do the role of tiger sharks that we are not? I would say, damn thing. Let's stop fishing the tiger sharks. And if we have the tiger sharks, we will not have this problem because the tiger shark eats a huge amount of green turtles in nothing. So that would be my suggestion.
That's a hard
Nobody.
political problem.
I know it. I know it.
But you've overlooked the one solution that's clear is restoration.
Well, no, if the green turtles are there, restoration will not serve because they will
No,
eat it.
we used to have 40 manatees in our bay. We now have 150. And we've done a great deal of restoration, and it hasn't affected the restoration at all to have triple the manatees.
Yeah, well,
Nothing.
right now in this, I mean, unless you really create areas which are protected for the herbivores, etc., which are really huge, I don't think restoration will work. When the turtles leave, then of course. But you don't need to restore them, huh? They grow very quickly. I mean, these species are just the Cymodosia, which will be the first one. In 3 years, you will have it recovered. So it's a natural process.
Anyway, thank you very much, Teresa. Fantastic.